As a park ranger, there's nothing I fear more than a forest fire. It's dangerous and it's hard to contain. Fire can wipe out an entire ecosystem. Fire can erase history. The tallest trees in the world grow in Redwood, more than 350 feet tall. Those trees can be burned just as easily as any other. 2,000 years of history can turn to ash in the blink of an eye. That's why protecting these trees is so important. That's why I started working as a park ranger in the first place, to protect history. Writing citations and filling out paperwork was never enough for me. I wanted to know that I was making a difference. A few years ago, I got that chance. The right combination of heat and lightning set fire to the thorns and the bushes tangled at the bottoms of the redwood trees. The dense landscape, often too tangled in roots to navigate, became the perfect fuel for the fire. It spread so quickly that park rangers and firefighters were forced away from the burning forest. We had to focus our attention on the areas closest to homes and cities. By the time we secured the perimeter and saved those civilized areas, a large chunk of the redwoods were ablaze. History was burning down all around us. My unit was stationed on a highway. Our job was to keep the fire from getting too close to the road. If it crossed the pavement, the residential neighborhoods would be in danger all over again. Nothing's louder than a forest fire. It was hard for us to keep our focus above the cracking of the trees, the rumbling of the engines, and the whirring of the helicopter blades overhead. We did our best. We did our jobs. We held that fire in its tracks. Our little triumph and the difference I made that day aren't the reasons I'm telling you this story, however. History is. That night, I learned that the trees weren't the only old things alive in that forest. It's normal to see wildlife running for their lives. Rodents, deer, and even the occasional bear will come sprinting out of the foliage and onto the road. A few of us were tasked with helping them to safety. We needed to keep them out of the way of the firemen. Eventually, I was asked to help with the wranglers. More animals than I'd ever seen came pouring from between the trees, all covered in ash and burns. I'd never seen anything like it. A lot of those animals, I'm sure, died not long after. There were too many injuries. There was too much smoke. We did what we could anyway. We cleaned them off and gave them water. We sent the lively ones on their way and helped animal control with the others. We had our own horrible little zoo before long. Soon there were so many animals around us that we couldn't help but notice their wounds. Not all of them were burned. Some of them were cut. Deep lacerations, always 3 or 4 running parallel to one another. It looked like the animals had run through a rake or a rack of knives. The first few times we dismissed the wounds as bear attacks. Then we saw the same lacerations on the bears themselves. No signs of a fight. As far as we could tell, the bears were only running. They were ambushed by something as they tried to escape the fires. Around the time that we accepted that, we started hearing them, whooping and chattering from somewhere behind the cracking trees. The forest makes strange sounds when it's in danger. We tried to ignore them. Then they got louder. The other animals thinned out. The creatures were screaming like frenzied chimps, howling and barking as they drew nearer to the road. We could hear them banging branches on the husks of trees. We wondered if they were trying to scare us off, push us back, clear a path across the highway that wasn't obscured by emergency personnel. We didn't know for sure. We didn't budge. A few of the rangers said they saw creatures in the trees. They were describing apes the size of grizzlies. I don't need to tell you that nothing like that lives in that area. Nothing that we know of, anyway. Suddenly, large stones started crashing into our vehicles. Windshields shattered and doors caved in. We ran to take cover, crouching behind our cars. Once we were all hiding, they came out. They ran like a stampede across the highway. They leapt from the rooftops of our vehicles and sailed over our heads. The light from the fire illuminated their bodies. The ash and the fur made the details hard to make out. More than a dozen of these beasts must have run across the road. I think we were all too shocked to keep count. We only realized that the running had stopped a few moments after the creatures had disappeared. We peeked out from our hiding spots one at a time and surveyed the damage. The steel and glass was battered. The animals were gone, taking cover somewhere on the safe side of the road. We looked between the faces of the rangers and the firefighters. None of us had any answers. We didn't have a choice but to get back to work. The fire was still there after all, still working to destroy the ecosystem that we were sworn to protect. We held the highway for 4 hours before we were allowed to change positions. None of us talked about the creatures we'd seen. I don't know if we were in disbelief or if we all figured that the animals had been through enough. They were scared and dangerous. Sending men after them would have brought on more trouble. We're far enough away from the fire now that I want some answers. I've come to accept that that night might have been the most important night of my life. I want to know how much of a difference I really made. My friend and I were driving around late one night. There isn't much to do where we live. It's a small rural town in the mountains, so teens don't have any other option but to drive around at night. My friend just got his license. We were pretty new to it. We felt very free. A lot of the roads aren't really roads at all. They're just dirt paths that lead from one area to another. Some are very straight, others tend to wind up and down. And really, there aren't many cars we seem to pass by because we're very secluded. All in all, it's a great place to learn how to drive. But it also makes it very terrifying at night, especially since there aren't many streetlights. You have to learn to depend solely on your headlights, and sometimes these just don't seem to help much in a situation where you might be seeing things. There have been plenty of times when I've thought I've seen something on the side of the road, but never really have the courage to face it. Especially not after this particular night. Me and my friend are driving, like I said, and it's very dark out. The roads aren't the flattest roads on Earth, so it's a pretty bumpy ride. We visited the next town, which is several miles away. We don't have a grocery store, so we had to drive a ways to get simple things like goodies and snacks. It was a summer night, so the weather was good. Every now and then there'd be a gust of wind that would feel so refreshing. We kept the windows rolled down. We had just pulled onto the street called Cerro, and I remember thinking that I heard a woman calling to us. It sounded like she needed help, so I asked my friend to stop the car. We paused for a bit. We listened for her. And just as we were about to continue on, we heard her again. My friend kept asking if I could see her. I couldn't. It was too dark, and my vision isn't the best. I tried calling out to her. I asked if she needed help. She didn't respond. So my friend starts calling out. Still, no response. I told my friend that I was going to get out and look for her. My friend was saying that it sounded like a terrible idea, but we couldn't just leave her. I kept playing the idea over and over in my head that there was a woman who was injured and needed our help. I couldn't leave her. I just couldn't. I got out of the car. My friend seemed upset about it, but I asked him how he'd like to feel if his mom or grandma needed help and no one helped her. He finally agreed that we would be doing the right thing by checking on her. I turn away from the car and start calling out again. There's plenty of trees around us, but you wouldn't be able to tell unless you knew the area like I did. It was too dark. I was also aware of a steep drop-off that was to our right, and that's where it seemed like the woman was calling from. So I stepped towards the drop-off while keeping a distance. I kept calling out, "Hello? Hello?" I didn't hear anything. I'm starting to get worried that we might be too late, that maybe something terrible had happened to the woman, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something standing behind my friend's car. I jumped with fright, but it was a woman. I assumed it had been the woman who had been calling out. "You scared me," I told her, and then I asked if she needed help. She replied that she did, that she needed a ride. My friend is out of the car at this point, and he's just pacing back and forth. I told the woman that it was my friend's car and that we'd have to ask him if he'd be up for a detour. My friend wasn't happy about it, I could tell, but I knew he wouldn't just let her walk around in the dark. He was a good person. So of course he agreed that it would be okay if we dropped her off a town over from where we lived. I'll admit, the woman was strange looking. I couldn't see much of her, but I could tell that she was wearing a long gown and that she had something over her face with her hair pulled up in a way that I'd seen my grandma wear hers a few times. I assumed she was either wearing a wedding dress or she had just left a funeral, but I didn't want to ask. I felt it would be inappropriate due to her being left on the side of the road. So we head for the car and I open the door for her. She seemed to be in a state of shock because she wasn't speaking much. I really did start to wonder about her. But she was secured in the back, and my friend and I hopped into the front seats. The ride is pretty awkward and quiet. Neither of us really know what to do or say, so we just kept our eyes forward on the road. Finally, I asked if she's lived around the area for long or if she's just moved here. I waited for a response, but I never got one. I'm observing my friend. I could see him looking through the rear-view mirror when he slams on the brakes. I shout at him because I don't know what he's doing. He turns around and points to the back seat. I turn around too. The woman is gone. My friend didn't tell me exactly what he saw in the rear-view mirror, just that he saw something evil. I'll be honest with you. After that night, my friend changed. He started to get very sickly looking. He'd speak incoherently about odd things and behave in unusual ways. About a month after that night, he disappeared. I don't know where he is, but I pray for him to be happy. I pray for him to be somewhere nice. I pray that what he had seen that night was not the cause for his disappearance, because ultimately, it would be my fault. 3 weeks ago, I decided to make a solo backpacking trip into the heart of the Adirondack wilderness. I stayed away from the trails because I wanted to get more in touch with nature. It was supposed to be a healing journey, which my therapist said I should do. Boy, I bet he won't believe when I tell him in our next session. He'll probably give me a one-way ticket to the mental health ward. However, I know what I saw, and it wasn't of this earth. I planned to backpack into the wilderness of the High Peaks region. I waited until after the close of deer season to avoid any hunters that may mistake me for a deer. After all, it has been known to happen. Since the season ends around the second week of December, I knew I needed to be prepared for cold winter and snow. I would bring along a sled to help bring in all my supplies, such as a hot tent, stove, and other supplies. I parked at a public parking lot with a note indicating where I'd be in case of emergency. From there, I made the arduous journey into the heart of the wilderness. Progress was slowed by downed trees that seemed to grab at my sled at every turn. However, I strove onward. I stopped a couple of hours before nightfall to set up camp and cut some firewood for the night. I knew I wanted to get further in so I could relax. The first night was relatively uneventful. I made a cup of hot chocolate while I stared at the clear sky. The beautiful aspect of the wilderness is you don't have to deal with light pollution. You get to see all of the stars in their glory. Now and then you see planes in the sky, but for the most part, the night sky is unmolested by man. At one point, I saw a blip of a light zoom quickly across the sky. I figured it was a satellite or some comet. Eventually, the cold night forced me into the warm tent, and from there, I drifted off to sleep. The next day, I moved deeper into the wilderness. An uneventful day as I slowly made my way deeper into the woods. Once I found a suitable location to camp at for the next few days, I quickly went to work getting everything ready. Within 2 hours, I had enough wood to last a few days. Then I began to relax as the sun started to set. Again, I enjoyed a cup of hot chocolate as I enjoyed the view of the night sky. After about half an hour, something seemed weird. I noticed a light that I assumed was a jet or a plane. It seemed normal at first, but then it changed direction every few seconds. Then it came to a complete stop in midair before going in reverse. That was incredibly odd because I knew that was no ordinary plane. Maybe it was some sort of new prototype being tested by the Air Force. Either way, I felt uncomfortable for some reason. This lasted for about 10 minutes. Afterward, I went to bed, which was the end of that night. The third day was freezing, so I stayed in camp most of the day. I read a little bit here and there. Mostly, I kept the fire going in the stove and napped. I ate a late dinner and decided to call it an early night. Around midnight, I was awoken by a blinding light. I was so disoriented that I didn't know what to think. At first, I thought someone was shining a spotlight on my tent. Then I realized that the light was coming from above rather than the ground. Then my mind began to race. My only explanation was a helicopter must have spotted me and decided to use me as a practice dummy. When I unzipped the tent to look outside, the light was instantly gone, and it was completely quiet. There should have been the sound of a helicopter at least flying away, but there wasn't anything. I became scared and immediately grabbed my hatchet. I couldn't sleep at all the rest of the night. There was something odd about the light as well. It seemed to pulse with different hues of light now that I reflect on what happened. It almost seemed alive, but that didn't make any sense. I decided that I'd start heading out at first light. I knew I had another night of camping before I could make it out of here, but I wanted to put some distance between me and whatever I dealt with last night. I skipped lunch to get more miles in before I had to set up camp, and I hiked a good distance. I felt more at ease for the night, knowing I had put a large distance in. I enjoyed my dinner before I headed to bed. I wanted to get up early and get out of the wilderness by noon. Around midnight, it happened again. I was woken again by a blinding light, but it seemed more intense this time, as if it was closer. I heard a metallic hum that grew louder as the light beam intensified. I was so scared by what was happening, I didn't even worry about my boots as I quickly unzipped the tent. What I saw next left me dumbfounded. Maybe 100 feet above me was a circular object that emitted light in its center. Other lights emitted from the sides danced across the surrounding area and constantly changed colors. The light in the center went out seconds after I was outside the tent. There appeared to be a glass window from which I could see the silhouette of two people. Except, I don't know if they were people. They were tall and skinny, but there was something about the shape of their heads. They looked long and cylindrical. I knew that image would stay with me forever. The whole thing only lasted about 2 minutes. Once I saw the pilots, the object they were in began to ascend quickly. Within a few seconds, it had disappeared into the night sky. I quickly packed up camp and followed my previous trail out of the woods in the dark. I arrived in the parking lot exhausted and freaked out still. I didn't waste time getting home, speeding most of the way. I'm afraid this isn't the last time I'll see that aircraft. That's what scares me the most.